Welcome to part 6, right? Treaty law clause. We're going to start out like I always do, doing a review. Reviewing parts 1 to 5, okay? So the first question is defining the idea of the word supreme or supremacy. The blank level of power or authority. You know this, right? This is easy, okay? The highest level of power or authority. Good. Next question, referring to the general welfare clause, right? It's based on this idea. Fill in the blank. If it's not blank, you blank do it. Right? This is simple stuff. You've done this a billion times, right? If it's not listed, you can't do it. Very good. Okay? Third question, fill in the blank and name the clause and constitutional reference. The Congress shall have power to make all laws that shall be necessary and proper. Blank, 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 blank. You know that, right? Congress shall have power to make all laws that shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. And that references which article, section, and clause? Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. Good. This is just second nature now, right? This is easy stuff. Circle the correct definition of an implied power. Either A, directly given and listed, or B, indirectly suggested. What is it? It's indirectly suggested, isn't it? And the obvious follow-up question you're used to here is, are there any powers granted to Congress that aren't specifically listed in Article 1, Section 8? Well, the answer is yes. There are powers Congress has that aren't specifically listed, but those implied powers have to be necessary in order to carry out the specifically listed powers. Okay? Good. Interstate means what? Blank states. Between states, doesn't it? Intrastate means inside of a state. Interpersonal means between people, and intrapersonal means within or inside of a person. Explain why understanding what interstate means is so important to understanding the Interstate Commerce Clause. Why does that matter? Is it just a word? Is interstate just a word? Does it actually have meaning? Well, it does have meaning, doesn't it? The Interstate Commerce Clause only applies to buying and selling, right? The commerce part that crosses state lines, right? The interstate part has to cross state lines. It doesn't apply to buying and selling inside of a state, between people, or with a person. Good. Define the following terms. Regulate is to set a standard. Very good. Commerce, blank and blank. Very simply is buying and selling, right? And lastly, among means between. Okay, here's a question. Can states set standards over each other? No. Okay. Not according to the Interstate Commerce Clause. Does the Interstate Commerce Clause give Congress power to regulate or to set a standard over the states? Well, yes, by definition, that's exactly what it does, right? What is that power? What's the power that Congress has over the states? Well, the power is to set the standard, right? Congress can prevent states from putting fees on each other. That way commerce continues to thrive. That's what we learned in the Interstate Commerce Clause presentation, right? Okay, let's end here with doing the memorization. Interstate Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. You ready? The Congress shall have power to regulate commerce among the several states. Great. All right, so the treaty law, remind me, easy schmeezy, right? Where does it show up? Remember we have our tree and our T, Article 6, Clause 2. Very good. All right, we're going to have the same analogy we always do, right? The car and the mechanic shop analogy. We got our players, right? The car owner representing the people in the states and the mechanic shop representing the federal government. Now in this case, though, it's a little bit different. We're introducing some other characters again, and we're not going to just talk about one mechanic shop, our mechanic shop. We're going to talk about a bunch of other mechanic shops. And in this case, these mechanic shops get together, okay? They all get together and they talk amongst themselves, and they come up with a contract with an idea that they're all going to agree to, that anytime any person brings their car into any one of those shops, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to write in that contract, we're going to give you an engine overhaul for $10,000. Okay? So you have this agreement among mechanic shops that says, hey, here's how we're going to treat incoming customers. First thing you do is you're going to overhaul their engine. Okay? So you do what you always do. You take your car into the mechanic shop and say, hey, let's write this contract up. I want you to do an oil change for me. Okay? And your friend the mechanic says, you bet, let's go for it. You walk to the inside, you look at the contract, and right there it says, oh wait, not only does it say oil change, the first thing there, it says, we're going to overhaul your engine for a cost of $10,000, right? Now wait a second. And you say, I don't want my engine overhauled, okay? And the mechanic shop says, sorry, sir, just the rules for all mechanic shops now. All us mechanic shops got together and decided that we would charge car owners for an engine overhaul every time they come in. And you say, well, it's my car, and all I want you to do is an oil change. Nothing we can do about it. We signed a contract, and we have to live up to our agreement with the other car shops. Right? We need to be men of our word. We signed this contract, we're going to follow through. And the car owner says, I don't care about your agreement with the other car shops. Look, what other car shops want to do with their customers is their business. But it has nothing to do with what I want you to do for me. And all I want you to do for me is to change my oil. Okay? Got a legitimate point there? I think he does. I just want you to change my oil. I don't really care. I don't care what other contract that you've signed with other mechanic shops. It has nothing to do with us, right? Okay, so let's apply the analogy here. Okay, remember we have our car shops. Okay, those car shops are representative of other nations, okay, other governments who are getting together and they're forming and signing a contract. That contract is the same as a treaty. Okay, a treaty has to deal with the interaction between nations, all the international, external, foreign things that happen. Okay, so that treaty is set up that way. So that's how we apply this analogy. And then you look at the mechanic shop and the car owner. We already know they represent the federal government and the people in the states. And what's the contract between them? Well, it represents the Constitution, right? The Constitution has to do with all the internal things, all the things that happen. There's a big word called domestic. All things that happen internally, inside of a nation. The Constitution is in charge of those. So would it make sense for a treaty, which is an agreement among nations, to come into our nation and tell us what is going to happen between our government and us? Does that make any sense? Of course not. That has to do with international issues. It doesn't have to do with national issues, okay? So for a treaty to come in and trump the Constitution and take over for the Constitution and have other nations be deciding for us how we're going to run our country, it's completely contrary to the idea of us being in charge of our government, not other nations being in charge of our government. All right, so let's open up your constitutions, right? Where are we going to go? Got it, Article 6, Clause 2, okay? Remember, that's the bottom of page 15 and the top of page 16. Open that up real quick. You're going to see that you already have some of that highlighted in yellow, right? From before when we have the supremacy clause. Here's where we're going in and finding where the treaty law clause shows up. So it's that bottom line on page 15 where it says, all treaties made or which shall be made. Underline, highlight that in pink. And then the first line of page 16, under the authority of the United States. Now, the last little part here, phrase, says, shall be the supreme law of the land. Notice that's the same wording as in the supremacy clause. This is where the treaty law clause and the supremacy clause share some space, okay? So you can maybe highlight half of it in pink and half of it in yellow, okay? So when you look at the whole thing, I'm going to throw this up on a slide so you can read it better. All treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. Got it? Okay. Why is it called the treaty law clause? Well, quite simply because the word treaty and law, right? It's a treaty law clause. What's a treaty? A treaty is a formal agreement between two or more nations. Okay? That's what a treaty is. Like I said before, it's the agreement between the nations. It's all the international things. Now, Article 6, Clause 2 starts out with this little phrase, all treaties made or which shall be made. Simply saying, look, their treaties are already made when they wrote the Constitution, and their treaties are going to be made. And then it ends by saying, shall be the supreme law of the land. Now, you've probably already seen a little challenge here because we've gone through this so many times. The challenge is too many people think that all treaties made shall be the supreme law of the land. But there's something in between there, isn't there? Okay? There's a gap. And what's that gap? What's that grayed out portion? What's the part that we're missing there? It's under the authority of the United States, which is a condition. We already talked about a condition, right? We talked about it way back in part 2 with the supremacy clause, okay? Let's review that real quick. A condition is what? It's a requirement that must be met first. Correct? You have to comply with the condition if you want the result, okay? So the condition in this case is under the authority of the United States. So in other words, as an example, if a skinny boy wants to become a buff bodybuilder, what's he got to do? You got it. He's got to lift weights, right? You can't go around it. You can't say, oh, that's going to make me hot. I don't want to do that. He has to lift weights if he wants to be a buff bodybuilder. Otherwise, he cannot be. If a treaty wants to become the supreme law of the land, has to comply with the condition of under the authority of the United States. So like we've done in other presentations, let's break that down. Let's look at the words under the authority of the United States. Let's take that and put that at the top of our slide here. under the authority of the United States. So let's define under. Under means like within the limits of, right? You can swim in the pool under adult supervision, which means within the limits of where the adults can see you and watch out and be responsible for you, right? Under means within the limits of. The next part is authority. Authority is a big one, a huge one. Authority is the power given to do certain things, okay? And lastly, in the condition, it says the United States. We just want to make sure that we're clear that the United States is the federal government. So when you take the verbiage of Article 6, Clause 2, all treaties made, or it shall be made, and let's change under to within, and let's change the authority to the powers given, let's change to the United States to be the federal government. You have this, all treaties made, or it shall be made, within the powers given to the federal government shall be the supreme law of the land. That makes sense, right? So that little clause that we've kind of rewritten to understand it, within the powers given to the federal government. Where do we find what is within the powers given to the federal government? Where do you find that? Where are the list of powers? They're in the Constitution. You got it. Exactly. They're in the Constitution. That's where we find them. Okay, quite simply then, if a treaty wants to become the supreme law of the land, it has to be made under the authority of the United States, or in other words, within the powers given to the federal government. And those powers that are given to the federal government are listed where? In the Constitution. So if a treaty wants to become the supreme law of the land, it has to follow the Constitution once again. Okay? It can't go around the Constitution. It can't just come up with its own powers. It has to follow the Constitution. Okay, so here's a quote from Thomas Jefferson. You know that I love this guy. I use him all the time. This quote's going to help give us a good introduction to the game. Here is the quote. In questions of power, then, bind men down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. Okay? It says, look, don't let men get up to mischief. What we need to do is wrap them up or chain them down by the chains of the Constitution. Okay, for this game, it's called the mummy wrapper. We're going to use tissue paper, okay, for our chains of the Constitution. Pretty simple game. You just have one of your team members stand there in the middle like a post, and you just wrap them up as quick as you can, and the first person to wrap up every bit of that person, wrap them up in the chains of the Constitution, they're the ones who win. Break free from your chains of the Constitution here. Hopefully that's a fun game to teach you, right? The idea that the Constitution is what is in charge of wrapping up all the mischief that men can get up to, right? If there's treaties or laws or there's some more, has to be done within the confines, restrictions of the chains of the Constitution. Okay? Here's our question. Can a treaty do what the Constitution says only Congress can do? Fair question, right? Can a treaty do what the Constitution says Congress can only do? First off, let's be clear. How are most treaties entered into nowadays? Most treaties are entered into through the United Nations, okay? So let's throw a treaty at you here, the idea of a UN treaty to declare war. This treaty declares war on country XYZ. Okay, so let's say the United States enters into a treaty with the United Nations that declares war on another nation. Okay? Would that treaty become the supreme law of the land? Well, quite simply, it just depends, right? It depends on what the Constitution says. Does the Constitution authorize the United Nations or a treaty to declare war? Well, does it talk about that? Where does it talk about it? Well, you guessed right. In Article 1, Section 8, correct, and in Clause 11, where it says the Congress shall have power to declare war. So very clearly, the Constitution reserves the right and the power to declare war to who? To Congress, not to the United Nations, and not to a treaty of the United Nations. Okay? Some people say, well, we entered into the treaty, we have to declare war. No. We only declare war if Congress decides we're going to declare war. Why would that make sense? Because the people who fight the war are the people of the United States. And if they're going to send their sons and daughters off to war, they better get a say in it through Congress. And Congress is accountable and has to answer to them. The United Nations doesn't have to answer to the people, nor does the treaty, right? The Congress is the one who's authorized because they're the ones who are accountable to the people. Makes sense, right? So we just talked about the question, can a treaty do what the Constitution says Congress can do? Now the other question is, can a treaty do what Congress isn't authorized to do? Okay, your premier classical examples is UN Gun Control Treaty, okay, United Nations Gun Control Treaty, where it says, no nation shall allow any of its citizens to own or use guns. Now, is that treaty, can it become the supreme law of the land? Once again, it depends on what the Constitution says. Does the Constitution say anything about gun control? Well, it does, right? In the Second Amendment. Very good, okay? Second Amendment says this, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Okay? Pretty clear. Let's read through, let's kind of define some of these words real quick for fun. The right, what's right? Right is like a freedom, okay? The freedom of the people to keep, what's another word for keep? Well, to own and bear arms. What's bear arms mean? Bear means to use arms, guns, right? Shall not be infringed. What's that big word infringed mean? Means taken away. Okay, so let's reread it. The freedom of the people to own and use guns shall not be taken away. Now, if that's what the Constitution says, it says the government can't take away guns. Can a UN treaty come along and say, no, you shall take away guns? No. Obviously, just like we talked about before so many times, it's not, the treaty is for international relations. The treaty is not for other countries to be able to tell us what we're going to do inside. An easy way to remember the idea of treaty is a treaty is to help other nations decide how they're going to treat each other. It doesn't have governance over what happens inside of our borders, inside of the United States. So a UN arms trade treaty is a great example of a treaty that would violate the Constitution. Too many people say, well, we signed a treaty. We have to be men of our word. We have to follow through with the agreement. The agreement between nations has nothing to do with what's going to happen in our own nation. Otherwise, why have the Constitution? Why not just have an international body like the UN trying to decide what laws we have? Which is a movement that really is unfortunate because it's happening. There are a lot of people who want the United Nations to be in charge of the country instead of the Constitution to be in charge of the country, and to govern with the treaty instead of with our founding document, the Constitution. Okay, so we talked about two bad examples, okay, of a treaty. Are there any good examples? What about a United States treaty with Mexico that says that revolves around border security and the protection from invasion? The treaty between Mexico and the United States says you shall not allow this border to be crossed. Is that something, a treaty that's legitimate? Well, once again, the question is, if it's legitimate, you'll be able to see it somewhere in the Constitution. Does the Constitution talk about border security and protecting against invasion? Actually, it does, okay? In Article 4, Section 4, Clause 1, it clearly states, the United States shall protect each state in this union against invasion. So if the United States is trying to protect its southern border, and those states there, Arizona, New Mexico, California, etc., from an invasion, and they enter into a treaty with Mexico to do whatever that takes to make sure that invasion doesn't happen, is that a legitimate treaty which can become the supreme law of the land? Well, yes, and how do we know? Because it says so in Article 4, Section 4, Clause 1, right? It grants that power to Congress to do that, and therefore the treaty can become legitimate because it doesn't violate the Constitution, it doesn't go against it, it actually upholds it. And it is executing the power that Congress has already been given to protect against invasion. Does that make sense? To see the difference between when a treaty violates the Constitution, when a treaty upholds the Constitution? The issue, once again, isn't what the treaty says. The issue is what the Constitution says, and whether the treaty complies with the Constitution. Okay, so now a game. Ready for this game? This game is called Chubby Bunny. So clearly, the condition that must be met for a treaty to become the supreme law of the land is that it has to be made under the authority of the United States. If you can't find the authority in the Constitution to do such a thing, the treaty can't do it. Okay? So we're going to play a game to simulate this idea. It's kind of fun. It involves marshmallows, okay? As you're going to see in a second, the goal of the game is to get as many marshmallows in your mouth as you say that condition, under the authority of the United States. Watch this, you're going to like it.
Under the authority of the United States. Under the authority of the United States.
Under the authority of the United States.
Under the authority of the United States.
Under the authority of the United States.
Good.
Under the authority of the United States.
Under the authority of the United States.
Under the authority of the United States. Number 7 or 8, I can't remember. Under the authority of the United States. Don't look. Alright. Clear your mouth out. Let's go on to the memorization of the treaty law clause. Ready? All treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. All treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. Good. Remember, you're reading with me, right? Out loud. All treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. All treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. Second to last. All treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. Okay, ready? All blanks. Here we go. All treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. Great. So you've now memorized 5 clauses in the Constitution, the 5 most important clauses everyone should know. Now go to intheconstitution.org/resources and take the quiz for Part 6.